Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. If you're new to the channel, here's what we do. We find men who went to Vietnam looking for something, a fresh start, a bit of warmth, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And we let them tell you what happened. No judgment, no lectures, just the story, the way it actually went. Today's story comes from Declan. He's 54 years old, he's from Limerick in the west of Ireland, and he spent 22 years as a Garda officer, and that's the Irish police force, reading people for a living, interviewing them, watching them lie, watching them tell the truth in ways that were somehow worse than the lies. Declan was good at his job, by all accounts, very good. And then one day, his life came apart in the specific, quiet way that lives do when you weren't watching the right thing. And he found himself on a plane to Vietnam with a bag and a pension, and the kind of hope that men his age generally know better than to admit to. He came home changed. And this one, I'll tell you now, this one is going to stay with you. Not because of what she did, but because of what he understood, eventually, about himself. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I need you to understand something about me before any of this makes sense. I am not a man who makes bad decisions. That's not me being arrogant. Well, maybe a bit arrogant. But it's also just true. 22 years in the Garda Síochána. Traffic division first, then criminal investigation. I have sat across tables from people who murdered their business partners and watched them tell me they were at their mother's house that evening. I have interviewed women who poisoned their husbands and cried so convincingly that the junior officers outside the room were passing tissues to each other. I know what deception looks like. I know what it sounds like. I know what it smells like if you want to go that far. So when I tell you what happened in Vietnam, I need you to hold that in your head. Not so you'll feel sorry for me, but so you'll understand that this can happen to anybody. And if it can happen to me, it can absolutely happen to you. My life before all of this was fine. That's the word. Fine. We had a house in Doradoyle, which is a suburb of Limerick, nothing remarkable. 3 bedrooms, semi-detached with a garden that I kept meaning to do something with for about 15 years. We had 2 kids, both grown by the time any of this happened. Siren and Offie, 26 and 23. Good kids. Grandkids. The kind of kids who'd grown up watching their father leave at odd hours and their mother hold the household together and had formed their own quiet conclusions about the marriage that I wasn't entirely aware of until much later. The marriage was fine. I keep using that word. It wasn't a bad marriage. I want to be clear about that. Mairead wasn't a bad person, and I wasn't a monster. And we didn't have some screaming, dysfunctional disaster of a household. We had a fine marriage. We were 2 people who'd met young and built something together, and then somewhere around year 14 or 15, we'd just, I don't know, the thing you're supposed to keep building, we stopped building it. We maintained what was there, painted over the cracks, that sort of thing. She left me for a man named Patrick. He's from the parish. I knew him. Not well, not a friend, but the kind of man you nod to after Mass and ask about his mother. That kind of knowing. I found out on a Tuesday in October. I won't go into the details of how. The details aren't important, and also I find I still can't say them without my jaw doing something involuntary. The point is I found out, and then there were several weeks of the sort of conversations that take all the furniture out of a room. And then there were solicitors. And then there were months of proceedings that cost me a sum I'd rather not repeat. And then the house in Doradoyle was Mairead's, and I got a handshake from my own solicitor and a cardboard box left on a neighbor's driveway. The kids were civil. They phoned. They came to dinner, separately, not together, and asked careful questions and offered careful support and were, both of them, clearly relieved when I told them I was fine. Because fine was the thing they needed me to be. And so fine was the thing I told them I was. I moved into a 1-bedroom flat in Castle Troy. I had my Garda pension, just under €1,900 a month at that point, and I had roughly 88,000 in savings, which was what survived the legal fees and the settlement. In Limerick terms, on my own, that was comfortable, manageable. I had enough. What I had too much of was silence. I'd never lived alone. I went from my parents' house in Ballynenty to a flat share in the city center to living with Mairead. And those 22 years in the Garda were never quiet because even when you're off duty, you're on duty in your own head. But alone in Castle Troy, there was this particular quality to the silence that I hadn't encountered before. It wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a life that had been completely load-bearing. My job, my marriage, my sense of myself as a man who had things sorted, and had had all the weight removed at once. I slept badly. I ate badly. I watched too much television and not enough of it. I went for walks along the Shannon that I told myself were healthy and that were actually just moving the silence around. And then one night, I think it was around 2 in the morning, I was on my third cup of tea and had given up on sleep entirely, and I ended up on YouTube. I don't even remember what I was searching for. Something about living abroad, maybe, or cheap places to retire. One of those vague searches you do when you're not really looking for anything specific, just looking for something that isn't what you currently have. The algorithm did what algorithms do. Within about 40 minutes, I was watching a video of a man roughly my age, English, I think, sitting on a rooftop terrace somewhere in Ho Chi Minh City with a glass of something cold, talking about how his rent was €400 a month. And the food was extraordinary, and people smiled at him in the street. Then another one. Then another. Men who'd been through divorces, redundancies, health scares, the general wreckage of a certain kind of Western life, and had washed up in Vietnam and found that the wreckage didn't follow them. Or at least it took a while to follow them. I watched for 2 hours. I knew, the whole time I was watching, exactly what it looked like. 53-year-old divorced man watching other middle-aged men talk about fresh starts in Southeast Asia at 2 in the morning. I have built a career on recognizing when people are vulnerable to something. I was a detective, and I got recruited by an algorithm, and I watched anyway. I started doing research the next day. Not impulsively, I want to be clear about that. I'm not an impulsive man. I spent 3 weeks reading forums, watching more videos, looking at visa requirements, cost of living calculators, healthcare. I approached it the way I'd approach any investigation. I gathered information. I assessed risk. I made a list of concerns and worked through them methodically. At the end of 3 weeks, I booked a flight to Ho Chi Minh City and a 3-month tourist visa. I told Xiaran I was taking a long holiday. I told Aofe the same. I didn't tell either of them how long I'd been thinking about it or how final the flat in Castle Troy had started to feel. I want to say it felt like an adventure. It didn't, particularly. It felt like the only decision I'd made for myself in about 2 years. Which was enough. Sometimes that's enough. I landed at Tan Son Nhat on a Thursday in March, and the heat hit me before I'd even cleared the jet bridge. Not warm, hot. The kind of hot that makes you question every clothing decision you've ever made in your life. And I was standing there in a long-sleeved shirt like an Egypt because I'd been cold on the plane. The airport was chaos, but organized chaos, which I appreciated. I'd done enough crowd management in my Garda years to read the flow of a busy space, and there was a logic to Tan Son Nhat even when it didn't look like it. Grab a taxi, don't use the guys who approach you inside the terminal. I'd read that 17 times on various forums. I followed the signs to the official rank, got in, and spent the next 40 minutes in traffic that made the M7 at rush hour look like a quiet country road. District 1. I'd booked a hotel on Bui Thi Xuan, nothing fancy, clean enough, about €40 a night, which felt like highway robbery by Vietnamese standards, but was, I was told, reasonable for a foreigner who didn't know what he was doing yet. I dumped my bag and went for a walk. The thing about Ho Chi Minh City that nobody on YouTube quite prepares you for is the scale of it. You can read that it has 9 million people. You can know that intellectually. And then you stand on a street corner in District 1 and watch what appears to be the entire 9 million of them pass you on motorbikes in the space of 4 minutes, and the number stops being a statistic. The noise. That's what I remember most. Constant horn. Not aggressive honking the way you'd hear in Dublin. It's more like communication, almost conversational. Bikes letting each other know where they are, pedestrians being gently informed that they're about to be part of a collision. I stood on that corner for probably 10 minutes just watching, and a woman on a Honda Wave went by with 4 plastic crates of live chickens balanced behind her, and didn't look remotely concerned about any of it. I did the tourist things. I went to the War Remnants Museum on Vo Van Tan, which I'll tell you is not a place you visit if you're trying to feel cheerful about the Western world. I walked around Ben Than Market and bought nothing because I didn't know how to negotiate and was too proud to be obviously overcharged. I found a plastic stool place in District 4 that a forum post had recommended and ate bun bo hu that was so good, I sat there for an hour after I'd finished it just to be in the same room as the smell. I drank Baya Saigon on Bui Vien and watched the backpackers half my age doing what backpackers do, and I felt, honestly, quite old and quite far from home, and also not entirely unhappy about either of those things. But the city. The city was relentless. I'd wanted distance from my life. What I hadn't anticipated was that Ho Chi Minh City would make me feel like I'd traded the silence of Castle Troy for something that had no volume control at all. 4 days in, I was waking up at 5 in the morning to the sound of a street vendor with a speaker on his cart playing a looping jingle, and the karaoke from the bar across the narrow alley behind the hotel didn't stop until midnight. I'm not complaining exactly. It was extraordinary. But it wasn't what I'd come looking for. I'd come looking for somewhere I could breathe. This was somewhere you survived. I booked a bus to Da Nang on impulse. Not much of a plan. I'd read it was quieter, coastal, halfway up the country. That was enough. The bus was 9 hours overnight. I slept better on it than I had in weeks. Da Nang in the early morning, coming in from the bus station. I took a grab to the first hotel I found with decent reviews, a mid-range place called the Muang Than on Truong Sa, right near Mai Kay Beach. And the difference was immediate. The city was a quarter of the size. The streets were wide. There were trees. I could hear birds, actual birds, between the motorbike horns. I walked to the beach at 7:30 in the morning and stood there looking at the South China Sea and ate a banh mi from a cart on the promenade and thought, here. This is the one. I extended my stay at the hotel 3 times over the next fortnight. I fell into something that resembled a routine, which is what I'd been missing since Castle Troy but hadn't known how to name. Coffee in the morning. I found a little local place 2 streets back from the beach. A family-run spot with plastic stools and a woman who made cafe sua ja so strong, it made your eyes water. And I went there every day, and by day 4 she had it on the counter before I sat down. Beach in the late afternoon when the worst of the heat had passed. Dinner at wherever looked good, pointing at things and hoping for the best, which worked out more often than it didn't. I wasn't happy exactly, I want to be honest about that. I was less unhappy than I'd been in Castle Troy. And at 53, that's about as much as you can reasonably ask for. The third time I extended my stay at the Muang Thang, I was dealing with a receptionist I hadn't seen before. Young, mid-30s, I'd guess, with a name tag that read Lynn. She processed my extension with the efficient patience of someone who does administrative tasks in a second language and doesn't find it remarkable. She looked at my passport, typed something, looked up. She said something along the lines of, "You've extended twice already. You must like Da Nang very much." Not a flirtatious comment. Observational, almost dry. The kind of thing a person says when they've noticed something and see no reason not to mention it. I said I liked it well enough. That I'd thought I'd prefer the South. She said Da Nang was better. Then she handed my passport back and told me my room key would work for another 7 nights. That was it. That was the whole exchange. I went upstairs. But I thought about it in the lift. Not about her, particularly, not in any way I could have named. Just about the comment, the flatness of it. I'd spent 22 years watching people modulate their speech, soften it, sharpen it, perform it, and that particular kind of dry, unvarnished observation was not what I'd been getting from most interactions since I arrived. She'd just said a thing that was true. The way you say things that are true. 3 days later, she recommended a restaurant on Tran Phu when I mentioned I was tired of guessing. A bun cha place near the market, she said, and gave me the cross street without being asked. I went. It was excellent. I came back the next morning and told her so. She said she knew. We exchanged numbers the afternoon after that when she was finishing her shift. She said she could show me a coffee place that was better than wherever I'd been going. I thought, this is fine. This is just someone being friendly. And maybe it was, at the start. That's the part one genuinely don't know. I've turned it over 1,000 times and I still can't tell you with certainty where friendliness ended and something else began, and whether that something else was calculation or simply human nature taking its course. I'm not sure it matters in the end. What matters is what I did next, and I'll get to that. The coffee she took me to was better than mine. I didn't tell her that for 2 weeks. The coffee place was a 10-minute walk from the hotel, down a hem off Le Douane. One of those narrow alleys where the buildings lean toward each other overhead, and you get maybe 2 feet of sky. No sign outside. Three plastic tables, a woman in her 60s running the whole operation from what appeared to be a single gas burner, and a very complicated relationship with a condensed milk tin. Lynn ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted. I thought about saying something about that and then didn't. The coffee arrived. I drank it. She watched me with the expression of someone who already knows how the experiment is going to turn out. I said it was good. She nodded once, as if that settled something. That was, I think, the moment I started to genuinely like her. Not the coffee, though the coffee was excellent. The nod. The complete absence of any need for me to elaborate or perform enthusiasm. In Limerick, if someone takes you somewhere new, there's a whole social contract around the response. You're expected to sell it back to them, make them feel the recommendation was worthwhile. She just accepted the information and moved on. I found that extraordinarily restful. We met for coffee 4 times in the first 2 weeks before it became anything resembling a date. And I want to be accurate about the timeline because I think it matters. Nothing moved quickly. That was another thing I noticed, and another thing I filed incorrectly. I'd half expected from everything I'd read that this kind of thing would move at speed. It didn't. She worked shifts. She had her own life, her own routines. She wasn't engineering opportunities. Or if she was doing it very slowly and with great patience. The first actual dinner, as opposed to coffee, was her suggestion. A kwan now near the market on Ong HKM that she said her family liked. We ate grilled pork and morning glory and garlic and drank 333 from bottles, and she asked me, in her careful film-learned English, what exactly a Garda officer did. I explained. She asked several follow-up questions, specific ones. Not the vague, polite questions you get from someone who's simply waiting for you to stop talking. I noticed that. I asked about her. She told me about the hotel job. 3 years, decent enough by local standards, roughly 11 million dong a month, which works out to about 400 euro. She said it plainly, no embarrassment. She had a sister in Jalat and a younger brother in Da Nang, and her parents were 2 hours south in Quang Ngai. She mentioned her father's health in passing, something with his kidneys ongoing, and then moved on to something else without elaborating. I noticed that too. I noticed she didn't linger on it. I logged it as, she's not the kind of person who uses family problems to generate sympathy. That was accurate as a reading. What I got wrong was the conclusion I drew from it. The money question came up, indirectly, within the first month. Not from her. From me. We'd been to Mai Kay for the afternoon, walking the long stretch of beach down past the resort hotels, and we stopped at a place selling cold drinks from a cart, and I reached for my wallet and she already had money in her hand. I said I'd get it. She said no, she had it. I said I'd prefer to. She gave me a look that was somewhere between amusement and mild irritation, and paid for both drinks herself. We had a version of that exchange 5 or 6 times in the first 2 months. She'd allow me to pay for dinner sometimes, larger things. But the smaller gestures, coffees, street food, motorbike petrol, she'd sort herself before I had the chance. I'd read a lot of forum posts by that point about the importance of watching for women who immediately expect you to pay for everything. Lynn didn't do that. I was glad. I told myself it meant something. I'd watched people get played for 22 years. I knew what it looked like. Somebody asking, somebody positioning, somebody creating a need and then letting you fill it. Lynn didn't do any of that, so I concluded she wasn't playing me. What I didn't understand, what nobody on those forums explained clearly enough, is that there's another way entirely. You can spend years building an understanding of one kind of approach and still be completely blind to a different one. A different culture, a different structure, a different set of rules about when you ask and when you don't, and what the asking even means. I'd calibrated my alarm to detect one frequency and she was operating on another. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We went to Hoi An for a weekend in week 7, I think it was. She had 2 days off together, which was rare, and she mentioned she hadn't been in years. I said I hadn't been at all. She said that was obvious. We took a grab down, an hour and a bit along the coast road, and spent 2 days walking the old town in the early morning before the tourist heat arrived, eating cow lao for breakfast at a place near the Japanese bridge. Her showing me what to look for in the lanterns, me getting comprehensively lost in the narrow streets while she waited at a corner, with the patience of someone who had correctly predicted this outcome. I paid for the accommodation, a small place on Tran Phu, about 2 million dong for 2 nights, 75 euro all in, which even then struck me as almost funny compared to what that kind of weekend would cost at home. I paid for most of the food. She let me. I noticed the shift and didn't remark on it because it seemed like a natural thing. We were on a trip, she was showing me around, it was reasonable. Which it was. Each thing, on its own, was reasonable. Her phone broke on the Sunday. Dropped it on stone steps. Screen shattered. She was annoyed with herself in a contained way, the same way she was annoyed when she found me funny, and she put it in her bag and said she'd sort it during the week. I said I'd get her a new one. She declined. I offered again. She said no, it was her problem. I said I wanted to, that it was fine. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely considered it, didn't immediately capitulate, and then said, all right, but a second-hand one, nothing expensive, she'd pick it herself. We found a phone shop in a side street off the market. She chose the cheapest one that still had a working camera. 8 million dong, 320 euro. She thanked me once, directly, and didn't mention it again. I thought, that's what an honest person looks like. And on a particular Tuesday night in week 8, sitting outside at my regular spot with a bottle of 333 going warm in my hand, I realized I hadn't thought about Dorodoyle in 4 days. Hadn't thought about Padrick from the parish. Hadn't done the mental maths of the divorce or counted my losses or rehearsed the version of events that made me seem like less of a fool. 4 days of just being in Da Nang. Being a man who drank warm beer and watched motorbikes and had somewhere to be the following afternoon. I knew even then that I should be careful about what I made of that feeling. A retired detective knows that relief can look a lot like happiness if you want it to badly enough. I wanted it to badly enough. By the end of month 2, I was thinking about extending my visa. A tourist visa was 90 days for Irish citizens, and I'd used nearly half of it. Extending meant either a visa run to somewhere like Cambodia or sorting a different visa category, which was more complicated. I'd started looking into it. I mentioned this to Lynn one evening. She said Da Nang was expensive for a tourist visa run, that she knew someone who used an agent in the city who handled the paperwork, if that would help. Purely practical. Just information. A few evenings later, over the phone, we were on Zalo by then, she mentioned that her father's hospital had called. They'd scheduled his next kidney procedure for the following month. She said it in the same tone she'd used to mention the broken phone. Matter of fact, not a lead-up to anything. She changed the subject herself. We talked about something else. I lay awake that night thinking about it. Thinking about her father, thin and dignified at a table in Quang Ngai I hadn't yet sat at. Thinking about a procedure I didn't know the cost of and hadn't been asked about. I decided I needed to go back to Ireland, sort out the flat, get proper paperwork, come back on something more stable than a tourist visa. I'd be gone a fortnight. I didn't yet know that when I came back, I'd stop being a visitor. Ireland in May felt like someone had turned the saturation down. I'd been away 9 weeks, which isn't long by any reasonable measure. But Da Nang had recalibrated something, and Limerick came at me gray and close and smaller than I remembered it. I sorted the flat first, 2 weeks' notice to the landlord, which he took without much ceremony. I put what I wanted to keep into a storage unit on the dock road, mostly books, a few things from the marriage I hadn't been ready to throw out and still wasn't, and donated the rest to the Vincent de Paul on Mulgrave Street. The whole process took 3 days. I'd spent 19 years accumulating a life in that house in Dorodoyle, and I'd apparently distilled what remained of it down to 12 boxes and a storage receipt. Kiran came for dinner on the Thursday. He's the more cautious of the two, always has been, and he asked careful questions about Vietnam the way he'd ask questions about a used car he suspected might have problems. Was it safe? What was I actually doing out there? Was I being sensible? I said yes to all 3, which was true enough. He didn't ask about Lynn because I hadn't mentioned Lynn. I'd told neither of the kids about her, which I told myself was simply because it was early days and there was nothing to report. There was another reason, which I was less honest with myself about. I knew what the conversation would look like, and I didn't have the energy for it. Ath came Saturday. She's warmer than her brother, more like her mother in that regard. And she hugged me at the door and said I looked well, which I did, genuinely. She was pleased about that. She asked about the food and the weather and whether I'd learned any Vietnamese, and I said I was working on it, which was optimistic. She didn't ask the careful questions, but as she was leaving, she stopped in the doorway and said, "You're being careful, aren't you, Dad?" And something in how she said it told me she wasn't asking about road safety. I told her I was. I booked my return flight before the week was out. The visa agent Lynn had mentioned sorted me a 3-month extension through an arrangement I didn't inquire about too closely. This is fairly standard practice in Vietnam, I'd learned by then, the bureaucratic reality of long-term tourist stays, and I was back in Da Nang on a Tuesday morning in late May. Lynn met me at the arrivals hall. She'd taken a half day from the hotel. She had coffee from the place in the hem in a paper cup, which she handed to me in the car park. She said the agent had confirmed my paperwork. She said the weather had been good. We drove back into the city, and it felt, I am not exaggerating, like returning to somewhere I lived. Not visiting. Returning. Within 2 weeks of being back, she raised the Quang Ngai visit. Carefully. She said she understood if it was too soon, that there was no pressure, that her family were curious about him. She caught herself, switched to the English, about me, but she didn't want me to feel obliged. She presented the whole thing as though it might be an inconvenience to me. I said I'd like to go. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. Same nod as the coffee. Settling something. The drive south took just under 2 hours on the coastal road. We went on a Saturday. The landscape changed somewhere around 30 kilometers out, the city density softening into rice paddies, roadside stalls selling watermelon and pineapple, the occasional buffalo standing in a field with the absolute conviction of something that has thought about the situation and found it acceptable. I watched it all go by and said very little. Lynn drove. The house was down a lane off the main road. A modest single-story building rendered concrete, a metal gate painted dark green. The garden was small and immaculate. 2 chickens in a wire enclosure by the side wall. There was an altar just inside the front door, the kind you see in every Vietnamese home. Red cloth, photographs of the deceased, incense sticks in a brass holder, the smoke catching the light from the window, and I stopped just inside the door for a moment. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was clearly the center of something. Her mother appeared from the kitchen. A small woman, 60s, with Lynn's eyes and a great deal more energy than seemed proportional to her size. She took both of my hands in both of hers and said something I didn't understand. Lynn translated. She said her house was happy to have me in it. I am Irish and I was raised Catholic, and whatever my relationship with all of that is now, I understand hospitality as a serious thing. Not a performance, a statement. I took it seriously. Her father was in the main room, sitting in a chair positioned to get the cross-draft from both windows. Thin in the way that illness makes people thin. Not frail exactly, but reduced, like something had been taken from him in increments. He stood to greet me, which clearly cost him something, and shook my hand with a formality that seemed to have been decided upon beforehand. Lynn translated what he said in pieces, that Lynn had told him I was a man who had spent his life keeping order, that he respected this, that his home was mine. I don't know what I'd been expecting. Something more guarded, maybe, or something more effusive. The performance of welcome. What I got was simple and direct, and I found it, I don't know. I found it easier to sit in than most rooms I'd been in for the previous 18 months. Her younger brother Minh was there, 24, quiet, the kind of young man who watches more than he speaks and takes everything in. The eldest, Tuan, arrived mid-afternoon, stockier, more assured, the natural authority of the firstborn. He shook my hand and asked through Lynn how I found Vietnam. I said I found it more straightforward than I'd expected. He seemed to find this a reasonable answer. Her mother fed us for approximately 6 continuous hours. Ban zao first, the sizzling rice pancakes folded around prawn and bean sprouts, then a clay pot of kako too, caramelized fish braised in coconut water, then rice, then soup, then fruit, then more fruit. At some point, I simply stopped tracking what was being put in front of me and accepted it. The father watched me eat with quiet satisfaction. I think he approved of the fact that I didn't make a fuss about unfamiliar things. At the end of the afternoon, when Lynn had gone to help her mother with something in the kitchen, her father and I sat in the main room in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Neither of us had enough language for conversation. He poured tea, we drank it. He looked at a photograph on the wall for a while. I looked at the altar. It was a companionable silence, if that makes sense. The kind you don't usually get with someone you've known for 3 hours. When we left, her mother held Lynn's face in both hands and said something too quiet for me to catch. Then she turned to me and said something else. Lynn translated it later in the car. She said she was glad Lynn had found someone serious. And then, this is the part one think about. Her mother cried. Right. Not dramatically, just briefly. The way older women cry when something they hoped for arrives in a form they weren't quite sure would come. She wiped her face immediately and said something that made Lynn laugh. And that was that. I'm Irish. I understand what a mother's tears mean. My own mother had cried at my Garda graduation, at my wedding, at both of my children's christenings. Those tears meant this matters. This is real. I felt the weight of them in a way I hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for. In the car driving back north as the light went flat and orange over the paddies, I made a decision. Not an impulsive one. I sat with it for a full 20 minutes of driving before I acted on it. I transferred 150 million dong to Lynn's account from my phone, roughly €5,500. Her father's procedure was scheduled for the following month. I didn't ask about the cost, didn't make it a negotiation. I transferred the money and then told her what I'd done. She went very still. She didn't thank me immediately. She looked at the road ahead for a long time. Then she said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." I said I knew. I was a detective. I ran the numbers in my head on the drive home. The hospital money, the phone, the Hoi An weekend, the meals, the coffees, the motorbike rental across 2 months. Somewhere around €9,000 across 3 months, which by Vietnamese standards was substantial and by Irish standards was, well, it wasn't nothing. But it added up in a way that made sense to me. It all added up. I just wasn't adding up the right thing. Before I flew home, I also stopped at a kitchen supply shop near the market and bought her mother a small rice cooker. The one in the house was old. She'd looked at a display model in a shop window in the afternoon. I went back alone, bought it, and asked the hotel to arrange delivery to Quang Ngai, roughly €200. It seemed like the right thing. Looking back now, and I know I do this a lot, this totting up, it's the detective in me that never fully retired. I think about the drive home from Quang Ngai, the way I made the transfer without being asked, the way it felt at the time, like a simple decision made by a man who finally had someone worth spending money on. Both things were true. That's the part that still catches me, even now. We found an apartment in month 4. Her suggestion practically framed. My current visa arrangement meant I'd need a local address registered somewhere eventually, and hotel cost over time made no sense compared to a rental. She was right on both counts. The apartment was on a side street off Nguyen Van Lien, a 10-minute walk from the beach, 8 floors up, a small balcony facing west. 14 million dong a month, about €520. By Da Nang standards for a 2-bedroom with air conditioning, that was fair, we split it. She paid her share. I paid mine in the utilities, which I offered to do, and she accepted without argument. I want to tell you about the breakfast table because I think it's the thing that explains everything else that follows. It was a small table. Plastic, pale blue, the kind you can buy in any Vietnamese household goods shop for about 150,000 dong. We put it on the balcony because the light was better there in the morning. Every day for 6 months, I sat at that table and drank coffee and watched the city wake up below us. The motorbike streams building, the banh mi cart that arrived at the corner at precisely 7:15, the construction crew on the building across the road who started at 6 and sang to each other while they worked. Lynn would sit across from me with her phone, reading something, occasionally showing me a photo of something funny or strange that she'd found, and wanted to know if I thought it was funny or strange. Sometimes we talked, often we didn't. It didn't matter either way. I had not sat at a breakfast table with another person in over 2 years. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the specific vulnerability of it. Not romance, exactly, or not only romance. The ordinary domestic fact of having somewhere to be in the morning. Someone across from you who isn't looking at you with the careful blankness of a child who doesn't know whose side to take. I would have paid almost anything to keep that table. I know that now. I think I knew it then, if I'm honest, which is probably why I never examined it too closely. The first request, and I want to be clear about the word request because Lynn never used it, not once, came in month 5. We were eating dinner, com tam from the place 2 streets over, the one with the broken sign that she'd introduced me to and that had become a weekly thing. She mentioned that her brother Minh had lost his delivery job. His motorbike had broken down. catastrophically beyond repair. And without a bike, he couldn't work. And without work, he couldn't afford a new bike. She said it in the same way she'd mentioned her father's kidney procedure over the phone in month 2. Information, not an appeal. I said, "What's a motorbike cost?" She said there were decent second-hand ones for around 30 million dong. I did the conversion, about 1100 euro. I said I'd sort it. She said she didn't want me to feel I had to. I said I didn't feel I had to. I wanted to. She thanked me the way she always thanked me, once directly, and then she moved on and we finished our dinner, and she told me something she'd read about a bridge project they were building near Santra, and that was the end of it. 35 million dong in the end. For a Honda that Min's friend knew wasn't a lemon. 1,300 euro. Min sent a message through Lynn. Thank you, and a photograph of himself on the bike outside his apartment. He looked pleased. I felt pleased. I think about that moment sometimes, whether I should have said no, whether it would have changed anything. I genuinely don't know. The need was real, the money was real. Min needed a bike, and I had the money, and the family didn't. That's not manipulation. That's just how it was. The roof came in month 6, heading into 7 when typhoon season was visible on the horizon. Tuan, the eldest, the practical one, had assessed the family home in Quangngai and priced what needed doing. A section of the roof had been repaired twice before with materials that hadn't held. He had a quote, 180 million dong, about 6,600 euro. He'd sent the figures through Lynn, who brought them to me on a weeknight with the demeanor of someone about to say something she'd rather not say. She put the figures on the table between us and said, I know this is a lot to ask. It was the first time she'd used the word ask. I went down for the repair weekend. I don't know why, exactly. Solidarity, maybe? Or maybe I just wanted to be somewhere that felt purposeful. I helped carry corrugated iron sheets from a truck to the house, which I was not particularly useful at, and ate dinner with the family both evenings, and on the Sunday morning her father came outside and watched the finished roof for a while, and then shook my hand and didn't let go for a long moment. His hands were cold. He was thinner than he'd been in May. 6,600 euro. Running total by month 7. Somewhere around 19,000 across all of it, I noticed. Obviously, I noticed. I wasn't an idiot and I hadn't stopped being a detective just because I'd moved to Da Nang. But there's a particular kind of self-deception available to people who are good at evidence. You can acknowledge each piece individually and still decline to assemble them. I knew what evidence accumulation looked like. I was choosing each time not to file the report. The medical expenses across months 8 and 9 were the hardest to track because they came in pieces. Her mother's diabetes diagnosis, medication that needed to be taken daily, a monitoring device for blood glucose that the provincial clinic didn't have, a specialist appointment at a private hospital in Da Nang because the wait at the public one was 3 months. Each amount was small enough individually to seem manageable. 12 million here, 18 million there, 30 million for the private consultation and tests. In total, across those 2 months, approximately 210 million dong, about 7,700 euro. I paid it, each time, without being asked in any direct way and without Lynn ever seeming to expect it as a certainty. Each time she brought something to me, she did it with the same visible discomfort, always with some version of, I'll pay you back when I can, which we both understood to mean she wouldn't. Because she earned 400 euro a month and what remained after rent and food didn't leave much margin for settling debts to a retired Irish Garda. My friend Seamus back in Limerick sent a WhatsApp in month 9. We'd been in the Garda together 20 years, and he had the habit of saying things plainly that other people spent energy dancing around. The message said, Are you being careful out there, Dec? I replied, Grand, yeah. Which was, I can say now without embarrassment, a deliberate lie. Not grand. Not catastrophically, not grand either. But I knew, by month 9, that the number was approaching 25,000 euro across the whole period, and I'd made an active choice not to write it down anywhere because writing it down would have meant looking at it. The guest house came in month 10. Tuan had found a plot of land, family adjacent, in the sense that a cousin held the usage rights, outside Da Nang, up toward the Hai Van Pass where the tourist traffic had started growing. A small guest house, 8 to 10 rooms. He'd done rough figures. Lynn brought me a folder, printed pages, construction estimates, projected occupancy rates based on comparable properties. She sat down and put it on the table between us. The blue plastic breakfast table on the balcony, same table where we'd had 7 months of ordinary mornings. And she said, "Tuan wanted me to show you this. I said I would. I don't want you to feel pressured." I looked at the folder. The numbers made a certain kind of sense. Tourist numbers in Da Nang were growing. The location wasn't bad. As a business proposition in isolation, it wasn't entirely mad. There was one significant problem, which she explained matter-of-factly. Foreigners couldn't own land in Vietnam, couldn't own the guest house directly. It would have to be in her name. I would be the investor, she would be the legal owner, and we would operate on trust and whatever arrangement we came to between ourselves. She said this without any apparent awareness of how it sounded from where I was sitting, which either meant she was an extraordinarily controlled person, or it genuinely hadn't occurred to her that it might give me pause. I asked for time to think. She said, of course. She took the folder back, left it by the door, and we had dinner, and neither of us mentioned it again that evening. I sat with that folder for 3 weeks. I ran the figures forward and backward. I had roughly €41,000 still available in savings after everything else. The guest house would take most of it. I didn't say yes. I also didn't say no. I just sat with it. On the balcony at the blue table with my coffee, watching the banh mi cart arrive at the corner at 7:15, trying to work out what I was actually weighing. There was a cafe I'd been going to since month 5, maybe 10 minutes walk from the apartment, on a quiet stretch of Tran Quy Cap. Not a tourist place, not an expat bar either. Something in between. Bare concrete walls, a few mismatched chairs, Vietnamese regulars who came every morning, and Westerners who'd been in Da Nang long enough to have found it. The coffee was good, strong, served in a small glass with the spoon still in it. I went there most mornings when Lynn was on early shifts and the apartment felt too quiet. Søren was a regular too. Danish, mid-50s, an engineer who'd come out 4 years earlier for a contract job and stayed the way people do. We'd exchanged nods across the room for months, the acknowledgement of two men who share a space without having any particular reason to talk. He had the look of someone who'd arrived somewhere and stopped running, and I suppose I recognized it because I'd been trying to acquire it myself. The conversation happened on a Tuesday in month 10. I had the guest house folder at home. I'd been sitting with it for about 10 days at that point, going back to it most evenings, running numbers, not arriving at a decision. Søren asked how long I'd been in Da Nang. I said 10 months. He nodded slowly, in the way of a man watching a particular scene he's seen before reach a particular moment. He didn't say anything concerning. He asked where I was from. I said Limerick. He said he'd never been to Ireland. I said it was grayer than Denmark. He said that was hard to imagine. We talked for a few minutes about nothing. Then he asked, quite directly, whether I was in a relationship. I said I was. He asked if I'd met her family. I said I had. He asked how long I'd known them. I said about 7 months. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something that I'm not warning you about? Specifically, just something I think might be useful to hear?" I said, "Go ahead." What followed was about 20 minutes, and I'm going to try to reproduce it accurately because it matters. He said it carefully without accusation, the way you deliver a forensic report to someone who hadn't asked for it and might not want it. He said he'd been in a relationship himself 4 years ago, a Vietnamese woman from a large family in Quang Nam province. That she was a good person. That he still thought that. That the relationship had ended not because of deception, but because of something structural that he hadn't understood when he walked into it. He described how Vietnamese family obligation works, not as a cultural curiosity, but as a lived reality. That the eldest daughter, or the one who earns most, or the one who has found a foreign partner with money, becomes the financial anchor for the entire family. Not because the family is manipulative, because that is simply how it functions, has always functioned, and the expectation is as natural to them as the expectation that a parent will feed a child is to us. Genuine need, genuine love, genuine obligation. All three simultaneously, without any of them canceling out the others. He said, "The thing Westerners miss is that it doesn't have an end point." That phrase. I'll remember it for the rest of my life if I live to be 100. It doesn't have an end point. He said the motorbike was real. The roof was real. The medical expenses were real. None of it was fabricated. But those things were also auditions of a kind. Not calculated auditions, not cynical ones, just the natural process by which a family tests whether the man their daughter has found is actually going to be there when things are hard. And I had passed every test. Of course I had. I was a generous man with money in the bank and no family around me in Vietnam, and a desperate need to be needed. I was, he said, using the phrase gently, not cruelly, the perfect candidate. And the guest house, he said, is the inflection point. He'd heard this from other men who'd been through it. The moment when you've moved from someone who helps with emergencies to someone who is the solution to a structural problem. Not a partner, an infrastructure. He said, I'm not saying she doesn't care about you, she probably does. But once you've built the guest house, you're not her boyfriend anymore. You're the financial answer to a question her family has been asking for years. And that role doesn't end when the relationship ends, it just changes shape. I walked home. I didn't say anything to Lynn that evening. She made dinner, bun rio, which she knew I liked, the tomato and crab broth with the tofu puffs floating in it, and we ate on the balcony and she talked about something one of the other receptionists had done at the hotel, and I listened and contributed to the conversation. And inside my head, I was doing what I'd been avoiding doing for 10 months. I was totaling the numbers. Hospital, 150 million dong. Phone, 8 million. Hoi An, roughly 50 million across the weekend. Motorbike, 35 million. Roof, 180 million. Medical expenses, months 8 and 9, 210 million. Apartment utilities across 6 months. Incidentals, the rice cooker, 37,800 euro, give or take. Not fraud, not a crime. Genuine need, genuine affection, genuine cultural expectation without a ceiling. I gave myself a week. I used it to grieve something I didn't quite have a name for. Not the money. I've said that and I mean it. The money was survivable. What I was grieving was the breakfast table, the banh mi cart at 7:15, the specific ordinary piece of having somewhere to be in the morning, and someone across from you who wasn't looking at you like a problem they didn't know how to solve. I had the conversation on a Saturday. The apartment. Mid-morning. Good light coming in from the west. Both of us at the table where we'd had every morning for 7 months. I told her I couldn't do the guest house, that I'd thought about it properly and I couldn't do it, that I'd reached the end of what I had to give. Not because I didn't care about her or her family, but because I could see now what the structure was, and I wasn't able to be what the structure needed me to be. I told her I loved her. I used the word. I meant it. I also told her it didn't change anything. She looked at the table for a long time. Then she said very quietly, I understand. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't try to reframe it or negotiate. She just said she understood and looked at the table, and that was the whole of it. She wasn't surprised. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I had half expected, some version of me had half expected, shock or hurt, or some evidence that she hadn't seen this coming. There was none of that. She understood, and she wasn't surprised, and I believed both. I booked a flight home that evening, 1 week out. I told her over dinner, which we ate in a silence that wasn't hostile. She nodded. She said she'd take the week's notice on the apartment. I packed on the Friday evening. There wasn't much. When you've lived out of a bag for 10 months, you learn not to accumulate things. One large case, one small one. I'd arrived with that, and I was leaving with that. A year had passed, and the luggage was the same. Most of what I was taking home wasn't in either case. I sat on the balcony for a while after I'd packed. The city was doing what it did at night, the motorbikes thinning out, the karaoke starting up from somewhere 2 streets over, the lights of the Son Tra Peninsula reflected on the water in the distance. The banh mi cart was long gone. I'd been sitting at that table for 7 months, and I hadn't once thought about what I'd do when it was gone, which is probably the most honest thing I can say about the whole year. I went to bed. I slept better than I'd expected. In the morning, I said goodbye to Lynn in the hallway of the apartment, which we did quietly and without ceremony, and I took a grab to Da Nang Airport and boarded a plane for the first time since I'd arrived, heading home. Limerick in November is a particular shade of gray that I'd forgotten about. Not dramatic gray, not storm gray, just the ordinary persistent gray of a city that doesn't make a fuss about its weather because there's no point. I came out of Shannon Airport into it and stood at the taxi rank with my 2 bags and thought, right then, I'd arranged a flat before I left Da Nang, a different one from Castle Troy. Same city, different street, ground floor this time. A small garden that I told myself I'd do something with. The landlord had left a key under a pot. I let myself in, put the bags down, and stood in the kitchen for a while looking at the surfaces. Someone else's life recently vacated. Not mine yet. I expected the silence to be devastating. It wasn't. I'm still not entirely sure what to do with that. I sat on the floor and there was no furniture yet. I'd arranged delivery for the following week. And I did what I'd been putting off doing for the entire flight home. I wrote down the numbers. Phase 1. The courtship. Months 1 and 2. The phone, the Hoi An weekend, the meals, the coffees, the motorbike rental. Roughly €3,200. Phase 2. The family introduction. The hospital transfer. 150 million dong. The rice cooker. Roughly 5,700. Phase 3. Living together, months 4 through 9. Min's motorbike, 35 million. The roof, 180 million. The medical expenses, 210 million. Utilities and incidentals across 6 months. Call it 25,000. I added it up 3 times. The total across 10 months was €37,800. Give or take a few hundred depending on exchange rate fluctuations I hadn't tracked precisely. I had €46,200 remaining. My Garda pension would arrive on the 1st of December as it always had. Just under €1,900, same as it had been arriving every month while I was sitting on a balcony in Da Nang, eating someone else's family's problems. I was not ruined. Not close to ruined. I was, by any reasonable measure, a man who'd had an expensive year and come home intact. I sat with that number for a while. €37,800. Not theft, not fraud. Not a scam in any sense that would interest the Garda Síochána or any legal body in any jurisdiction. Just 10 months of genuine need meeting, genuine generosity in a cultural framework I hadn't understood when I arrived and had only partially understood when I left. The question people ask, and Seamus asked it directly over a pint on the second evening back, the way Seamus asks things, is whether she actually cared about me. And I've thought about it enough that I can give you an honest answer now, which is, I think she did. I also think that if my savings had run out in month 4, the caring would have ended around month 5. Both things are probably true. Being Irish has taught me that most true things come in pairs like that. 2 uncomfortable facts sharing a table, neither one canceling the other out. The thing that cost me most wasn't the money. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to make this about the money, and the money is not where the injury is. The injury is the dignity of it. I spent 22 years in the Garda reading people. I interviewed murderers and I knew when they were lying. I sat across tables from fraudsters and watched their tells. I built my professional identity around the idea that I understood how people worked. And I went to Vietnam and I was read accurately before I'd unpacked my first bag. The hunger in me, for warmth, for company, for someone across from me at breakfast who wasn't looking at me like an obligation, was visible from the moment I walked into that hotel lobby. Probably visible from the moment I booked the flight. A lonely, retired detective with money in the bank and nobody waiting for him at home. I was, as Søren had said, gently but accurately the perfect candidate. That's the one that stings. One that, not the 37,000. The readability. And yet, a year of that breakfast table. A year of the city waking up below the balcony and the banh mi cart at 7:15, and someone across from me who found me funny and occasionally told me I was wrong about things. A year of being just a man in a place where nobody knew my history or gave me that look at Mass. I can't tell you it was worth €37,000. I also can't tell you it was worthless. I went to Vietnam to stop being lonely. I found out that loneliness has a price, and I paid it. And now, at least I know what it costs. That's the whole of it, really. I'm back in Limerick. The flat is fine. The pension arrives every month. Siran and Aoif know what happened, broadly, because I told them a version of it that was honest without being complete. And they responded with the careful, supportive neutrality that they've inherited from both their parents. Seamus thinks I was an Egypt. He's not wrong. I still don't tell people I got scammed because I don't think that's accurate. I tell them I went somewhere and paid for something that I needed, and the price turned out to be higher than the menu suggested. I'm not going back. Not because I hate Vietnam. I don't. Not because I blame Lynn, I don't entirely, but because I know myself well enough now to understand that I'd do it again. The loneliness hasn't gone anywhere. The need for the breakfast table hasn't gone anywhere. I'd go back and find another cafe off another hem and sit across from someone who didn't know anything about Dora Doyle, and I'd convince myself I was being careful, and I'd be wrong again. That's not Vietnam's fault. That's mine. The wisest thing I've done in 2 years is to recognize that and stay home. That's Declan's story, and we're grateful to him for telling it plainly, without self-pity, and without making Lynn into a villain she may not have been. What you've just heard isn't a scam story, not exactly. It's something more complicated and, honestly, more useful. It's a story about a structure, the way Vietnamese family obligation works, genuinely and without malice, and the way that structure can absorb a Western man's savings as efficiently as any deliberate fraud, and the way professional skepticism, personal pride, and plain old loneliness can work together to keep a smart person from seeing it clearly until it's done. If you're watching this from Vietnam right now, and some of you are, we know that, and your story sounds like it's in month 3 or month 5 of what Declan just described, here's the question to ask, not whether she's lying to you. Ask whether the structure you're inside of has an endpoint. Ask whether there is a number, a final bill, a last request after which everything settles and the obligation stops. If you can't answer that question clearly, run the numbers. Not the romance numbers, the romance. The actual numbers. Write them down. Look at them. That's what Declan didn't do until it was already over. Thanks for being here at Inside Vietnam. If Declan's story landed for you, leave a comment. We read them, and they matter. If you know someone who's out there right now thinking they're different, that this won't happen to them, send them this video. It might save them a breakfast table's worth of regret. We'll be back soon with another story. Until then, take care of yourselves out there.